can recall things from my childhood. I grew up with this, and I'm 73 now. I guess this was the time when Russia had Sputnik. I don't know if it was a satellite or a spaceship, I don't know what it was. But anyway, Sputnik was popular and people were starting to talk about UFOs and ETs, and my mother and my grandmother were very interested, and I believe they belonged to different book clubs where they discussed in books about ETs. I can remember laying on a blanket in the backyard when we would come to visit and we would look for UFOs in the sky, and sometimes we would think we saw them. But I don't know if my grandmother or mother ever saw any. But I do remember my mother coming home and saying, when she and Daddy were driving home from the next town, that they had seen something unusual in the sky, and then my sister would say she had seen cigar-shaped ones. I remember seeing UFOs that were the saucer shape. And it would happen in spurts, like nothing would happen for a while, and then all of a sudden maybe I would see one in the sky 2 days in a row, and then I wouldn't see anything for another couple of years, and then I would see them again. But it wasn't until in my 20s that I started actually having occurrences. I had mentioned to you about a little bump in my wrist. It was like a little BB, and I would play with it all the time. And I remember I was kind of a hypochondriac growing up. I always thought I was sick and I wasn't. But my parents took my sister and me on a historical trip to Washington, D.C. to see all these historical places. And during that trip, I can remember sitting in the back seat, and when they were driving, I was playing with that BB in my wrist, just moving it around and asking my mother if she should take me to the doctor about it, because it was just rolling around in my wrist, and I would play with it until it would get kind of sore, and she just told me it would go away, and it was probably a calcium deposit or something like that. And one day, it just disappeared. And it wasn't until later that I kind of started putting 2 and 2 together and feeling like maybe it was an implant, but at that time, I didn't know anything about anything like that. So it may have been something, but it was there, and then it was gone. There are specific times I can remember seeing something in the sky and just knowing, oh wow, it was there, and it just kind of turned on its side and disappeared. I mean, I was young at the time, I didn't know what it was. But when I was growing up, I had all kinds of occurrences, all kinds of things happening to me, and I just took them as normal. I guess what I thought at that time is, it must be one of those things that happens to everybody, but nobody talks about it. That seemed to be how I related to things growing up. It's when I'm getting into my awakening process and not what you want to hear about the UFOs. I look back now on things and I can kind of piece together things like missing time or why I did something that led to something. I guess it's all intertwined, the waking up process along with the UFO experiences, with the ETs and everything, because I'm trying to think how to best lead into this. As a child, I learned I would eavesdrop on my mother's telephone conversations when she would be talking to her women friends, and I would hear her say something, and I would think, well, that's not true. And then, she was gossiping or whatever with their women friends. And I would think, well, maybe when you say this, it really means that. It was the opposite in my mind. I was putting things together this way, which I now know is not the way most people think. But I can remember being in the car with my mother and we were driving someplace and looking at the grass, and I asked my mother, when I look at the grass or the pasture, whatever, and I see green. Do you see the same color of green? I mean, I was asking questions like this, and my mother would say, where do you come up with these things? My grandmother, who died when I was about 13, taught me how to feel energy and how she was a healer. People would be drawn to her and she would teach me things, but I didn't really realize what she had taught me until after she had passed away. So I think I had always been awake and aware, but I always thought everybody did that because I was dumbed down as a child. I was told I was stupid and that I was slow. And so I assumed everybody did this. And I was nothing gifted or special. It was just something that you didn't talk about, so I understand that it's all kind of is intertwined. So it all kind of goes chronologically. So I think the next thing that happened is after college, I was hired as a flight attendant. But at that time, we were called airline hostesses, and I was hired with a West Coast airline. At that time, this was in the 70s, and it was a glamour job, and I didn't feel glamorous, but I started really waking up. I was probably in my late 20s, and I was visiting my parents at their home, and I had this dream. I woke up in the morning, and when I came down to have coffee with my mother, I said I just had the strangest dream, and it seemed to take all night, but it is so real, I feel like it really happened to me. I dreamed that I was taken aboard in a small UFO that was hovering above trees. When I entered it, it expanded and it was huge inside. I felt like I was in a mothership. It was huge, and there were these 3 beings, and I saw them as 3 beautiful women. They communicated by telepathy. I was talking with them through our minds. It was all that way. But the 3 beings that I saw as 3 beautiful women, a blonde, brunette, and a redhead. I think they told me that what I was seeing was my perception. And as hard as it is to believe, perception was not in my vocabulary at that time. I had to look up what they said later. It may have been a 3-headed being, I don't know, but I saw them this way, and if I told you about it the next day, I would describe them as 3 beautiful women. If I was to draw you a picture, and I knew I was lying when I was telling people this, I actually saw like cartoon characters, but I would still describe them as the 3 beautiful women. I never felt as much love around them as I did at that time. I told my mother the next day, I said, I felt like I was downloading all this information, but it was driving me crazy because I couldn't remember what I was downloading, but I felt like they had told me how the UFO operated. I want to say it was like crystal power, but they explained all these things to me. When my visit was over, I was sad to leave them, and I asked them if I would ever see them again, and they said, well, we're usually in the southwestern United States. And I don't know if they showed me a map or if it was by telepathy that I saw the map of the states where they hovered over. It was like western Texas and New Mexico, maybe Arizona, that part of the United States. So it wasn't like they told me they were from another star system or anything like that. When I told my mother the next morning, I also drew pictures. I told her about the inside, but I could draw pictures of the craft from the outside. Outside, I told her what color lights they had on them, because it was a circular disc-shaped UFO, as I recall, but it was triangular underneath. It had 3 lights, and I can't remember, it seems like they may have been red and green. I don't really remember that now, but I drew all these pictures, and then the following morning, the newspaper, the Lexington, Kentucky, the second section would have been your state news, and it was an article on the bottom of that second section. That was the state news. And it was interviews with different people in other parts of the state who had reported signings of UFOs the same night, of my experience. They were reporting the exterior of the crafts and what they had seen, and it was exactly what I had seen. While I was visiting my parents, I kept the article and I started to pack it to take home with me, but I threw it away, and I don't know if that was because I couldn't explain it. So rather than deal with it, I just threw it away. Well, since then, when I moved back to the area about 35 years ago, I went to the Lexington Library trying to find that newspaper article and cannot find it. And I mean, I went there several times and it just looked through their microfilm and all that, and I couldn't find it. But I know what I saw. In the late 70s, like around 78 maybe, or not too long after that, I had a layover in El Paso, Texas. I think I was based in Houston at the time, so I was flying with a Houston crew of pilots and flight attendants, and we had spent the night there, and then, typically in the morning around dawn, that would be when we would report to the airport for our flight. So the hotel man dropped us off in front of the airport, and then we would take the shortcut and walk across the tarmac. And so we were walking across, and there is probably a mothership over the El Paso airport. The pilot saw it and the others, as far as I know. I mean, we were all together. They all should have seen it. I heard one of the pilots, I think it was the captain, who said, "What the hell?" And you know, in my gut, I knew they were observing me. Yeah, I knew I was scared. I was saying to myself all the way across to flight operations, "Please don't take me. Please don't take me. Please don't take me." The crew didn't know that. The crew were saying things like, "What is that?" We went on inside to the crew lounge, and this would be downstairs below the gate area. And the pilots, They needed to do their pre-flight check around the aircraft and check weather and all that, so I assumed they were going over to check with the guys to find out what it was that we were seeing that was above the airport. Well, when I got up to the crew lounge with the flight attendants, I'm trying to get a conversation going about what we've just seen, and they're all oblivious. It's like they didn't see it. And I'm like, we just saw this huge thing in the air. They wouldn't talk about it. So then we took the outside of the jetway, going to the aircraft. They have the exterior stairs. So we flight attendants, we had to be on the plane 20 minutes before departure to check everything and load the passengers. So we took the stairs up and I looked up in the sky, and it was gone. No UFO anymore. But I knew what I saw. After we had served the passengers, I went up to the cockpit and asked, "What did you find out?" And they're like, "Find out? What are you talking about?" It was like they hadn't seen what we saw. And looking back at that time, I thought, well, maybe it's because of the flight recorder. They don't want this on the flight recorder because, they'll have to record it or something. I look back now and I think, I think that was just meant for me. And it was verification of what had happened in what I call the dream. Okay, so that happened. And then it was in the late 70s or the early 80s. So then I left the airline industry. Now, I may have had things happen during that time, but I don't recall them. I left the airline industry completely in the mid-late 80s, like around 86, I think, and went into my present occupation around late 88, and this would have been probably around June of 89. I was living in my first house, and I had a cat, and it's middle of the night, and I woke up. I could feel something like the air. The only way I can describe it is the atmosphere in my bedroom felt like mercury. It felt thick and heavy, and I woke up and I saw 6 or 8 little 3.5 or 4 foot high little gray guys in my bedroom around my king-sized bed. My cat is sound asleep. It's not stirring him at all, and next to my head on my right side, there's a taller gray, and he's standing there. The most frightening part of it was I recognized him. I knew I had seen him a lot of times in the past. Now, I don't know when. I can't tell you any of that, but I knew I had seen him before and that he communicated with me. I was so frightened. I would have screamed, except it's like I was completely froze. My body is reacting, but my body is laying there, and all I can do is see. What he's saying to me by telepathy is, "Carole, just go to sleep and it'll all be over." I closed my eyes and I went to sleep. And the next morning, when I woke up, it was a Sunday morning. I'm brushing my teeth and noticed my nose is bleeding a little bit. And the first thought that went through my mind was that must be when they inserted that thing in my nostril, and that freaked me out. I had other occurrences like that, but that one shook me up. That one had me frightened. And it was about that time that Whitney Strieber came out with his book, Communion, and that had the picture of the gray on the cover. And when I would see that book, it brought back exactly what I had seen in my bedroom. And I didn't write him or anything, but Hopkins, he came out with his book, Missing Time, and then there was another one at the same time about UFO abductions. I wrote him. This would have been in 89, so this is before the internet and all that. And so I wrote him an 11-page letter and mailed it to him through his publishing company. And they apparently forwarded it to him. And when he received it, he called me immediately, and I told him what had happened to me. And he, an investigator who was out of Dayton, Ohio, and Wright-Patterson, and his name was Lynn Stringfield. Now he's deceased now, but Hopkins also connected me with a doctor in the Cincinnati area who was investigating and doing hypnosis to try to retrieve memories like this. But I never could retrieve the memories, and what was happening the first time, I think I was afraid. I took a girlfriend with me because I didn't know these 2 men, and I'd never been hypnotized that I knew of before. I was hypnotized, but I would freeze up. I couldn't talk, because what I was seeing was like I was in a cage. And there was this giant praying mantis on top of me and would not let me talk. The doctor continued to try to work with me to get it out. But I kept having the problems with the praying mantis, and so nothing really came up. But now what was interesting is this doctor, I can't remember his name, that he worked in a hospital in Cincinnati, and I think he worked with patients with sleep disorders. But also, he would do 3 or 4 times a year. He would invite all the people that he worked with, and there were a lot of people in the military who had UFO experiences, and he would invite all of us, and there was this big cafeteria or something at this hospital. And we would all meet. There would be like psychiatrists and other kinds of doctors that would be there too because they were getting more and more reports of this. He would go around the room with the microphone and people would tell their stories. Well, it got boring to me because you've heard one UFO story, you heard them all. It's kind of like near-death experiences. You listen to one, they all sound pretty much the same. Believe me, it's the same thing with UFO experiences. And I remember this one guy talking about how he was at the Tampa Bay area, and there was a crowd of people. Maybe it was the fireworks on the 4th of July or something, and there are all these hundreds of people around. And there's this huge UFO above Tampa Bay, or maybe there's a whole bunch of them. And he sees them, but nobody else sees them. And that was interesting to me because I had that happen in El Paso, but there were others, and it just eventually, well, it was frightening at first to drive home because those meetings would end at around 9:30 at night. It was an hour-and-a-half drive home, and I'm scared to death. Something's going to be hovering over my car. So eventually, I just stopped going. I was measuring the wall, around my bed to figure out the height of those guys. I was kind of neurotic about it, but didn't feel like I could talk to people because they would think I was crazy. And in 2013, I had read all of Dolores Cannon's books and decided to go to her UFO conference in Arkansas. So I met Dolores because I was determined I wanted to get an appointment with her to be hypnotized and regressed if necessary. And I did meet her. I've got pictures with her. However, I couldn't get an appointment. She died probably 6 months later, something like that. I tried to get an appointment, but she had an 8-month waiting list. She had trained a lot of people in her quantum healing. Since she couldn't see me, I found somebody in the local Kentucky and went to her to be regressed to find out what had happened to me. And she recorded it, but I don't know that. I think I probably should go back and listen to the tape, but I've never listened to it. I did it. And it was like, it gave me peace afterwards, but I don't even know where I've put the tape, and it just feels okay to just live my life and not think about it. So that's where I kind of put it out of my mind after that.
Thank you for listening to Carole's story. If you join Divine Teaching by Daniela membership, you'll get access to more of Carole's story, plus a whole lot more of exclusive membership content on all things spiritual, metaphysical, and psychological. As a member, not only do you get all that, Daniela will invite you to her private Facebook group where you will be part of a community of like-minded people. In this group, Daniela does a live every week. Twice monthly, she does mini readings for members. Try the membership out for 30 days for free. Sign up at divineteaching.daniela.com/30-day-free-trial. Just follow the link in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this.